The loudest, the biggest, the brashest. New York is its own character in every play.
The bad thing about New York is the pressure. You're always under pressure.
Here are the stories about those plays. It's New York Accent with Damon Amendolara.
Welcome to New York Accent, an Odyssey original podcast in tandem with WFAN. So glad you're with us. Damon Amendolara with you. And our next guest, for all of our viewers, all of our listeners, you guys have no idea how vital this next guest was to your life because you are watching this video on YouTube or listening to this podcast, all places that podcasts are available. He is the Godfather of Sports Talk. He is the creator of WFAN. He's the CEO of Emmis Communications. He was also once the owner of the Seattle Mariners. And at one point, his company was the largest privately owned radio broadcasting company in America. Emmis, Mike and the Mad Dog, The Fan. This guy did it all. He has also written a new book called Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down, which feels like the story of WFAN, the ups, downs, and reinvention of an entrepreneur. Joining us here on New York Accent is Jeff Smulyan. Jeff, how you doing?
I'm great, Damon. I'm great. Great to be with you.
So good to have you here as well. And your journey to radio starts as a kid in Indianapolis, and it starts on a transistor radio.
Right.
What's the magic of listening to a radio on a transistor radio? What's the magic of listening to a ball game in the Midwest as you're growing up, and what sucks you in?
Well, I think it was just a major part of my life. And I think it was the part of lives of a lot of kids in that era. The transistor radio was the first really portable radio in my era. I'm so old that we put them under our pillows and listened to ball games and top 40. And I think it was just a major part of our existence. And I did it, and that's how I fell in love with the business.
So it's interesting because I think today it's hard to imagine having a radio landscape that doesn't have sports talk in it, especially for listeners of WFAN.
Right.
So take me back before sports talk in the 70s, the 80s. What was sports on the radio? What did that consist of?
There were individual shows. I always talked about the fact, and it's ironic, I'm out on the campus of my alma mater, USC, at Jason Barron's sports conference. But when I was not paying attention in a class in the 1960s, I always thought about all sports radio. Thought it'd be a fun idea. There were always sports talk shows at night, but nobody had done the whole format. And when we bought the Doubleday stations, we had a chance to have an AM station. And we said, let's try all sports. Nobody in our company wanted to do it. And then everybody felt sorry for me because it was my idea. And we ended up doing it. And in the book, I have a favorite saying in life. The line between being a genius and an idiot is very fine. And I've been on both sides. So one chapter of the book is Idiot to Genius, the birth of all sports radio, WFAN. And then the next chapter is Genius to Idiot, my ownership of the Seattle Mariners. So if you live life long enough, Damon, you go back and forth.
So at this time, before WFAN, if you were a sports fan, you would listen to games on the radio.
Right.
Maybe you would have a nighttime radio host that would talk about the sports, but it would be on a news talk station. Or it would be at a music station, and they would get maybe an hour, 2 hours, something like that. And you were thinking, oh, I've heard a guy on the radio do an hour or 2 hours, but I think we can do 24 hours of that. That was your concept.
That was my concept. And most people thought it was kind of silly. And for the first year, it was called Smulyan's Folly. Jim Lampley called it the Vietnam War of Emmis. It wasn't going to work very well. And then we merged with the 660 frequency, the NBC. We bought that station. We put Don Emmis on the air. There's a funny story about that. And then we put Mike and the Mad Dog together, and the whole thing just came together, and it worked very well.
So before we get to Emmis, your concept is it's going to work in New York if it's going to work anywhere. Why'd you think that? Because
people have a greater affinity for sports in New York. They care more passionately. If you really look at sports in this country, and I'm on the West Coast now, it's just not the same affinity for sports that you have. And we used to say, if there's ever a place where people talk about sports and care about sports 24 hours a day, it's New York City.
And you weren't a New Yorker as a native, but you could just sense that going there, traveling there, working there. You said, if it's going to work anywhere, New York's the place.
Absolutely right.
So you have this concept. and
Yeah.
nobody's buying it. Nobody's
Right.
thinking in your boardroom, in your
Right.
conference calls that this is going to work. What were their hesitations?
Not enough listeners, not enough audience, not enough advertisers. It was losing money. And when we had Emmis is a very collaborative group, and we had a vote on doing the idea, and it got voted down. And one of my friends said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Look, you can't lead where people won't follow, so we shouldn't do it." And then the next day, some of my senior managers said, "Look, we're really doing everywhere else. We know this is your idea. We'll do it. We don't love it, but we'll do it." So that was the infamous birth of all sports radio in the United States.
ESPN launches in 1979, and at
Right.
first everyone thinks that's a disaster as well. But by the time you're trying to pull off the fan in 87,
Right.
Sports Center, ESPN had gotten a foothold. Did you look at them as an example? Hey, doing all sports on a platform can be successful?
Yeah, I think so. I think subconsciously you said, look, this is already starting to work. In those days, in the mid 80s, it was, not real successful, but starting to work. And we thought, there's no reason this can't have impact in local markets. Yeah.
So you start to assemble a roster,
Right.
and you've admitted the first flaw was you were looking for names instead
Right.
of local personalities. You
Right.
mentioned Jim Lampley.
Right.
Give us a sense of what the day parts looked like on the original WFAN.
Well, Greg Gumbel was the morning guy, and Jim Lampley was midday, and then we were planning to bring in Pete Franklin. He had a heart attack, so it took a little while. But it was big national names. Pete was well known as the biggest sports, the sports talk host in America, coming from Cleveland. So that was the idea, big names, and it was much more national in scope. And I think when we realized this has to be about New York, we changed some of the programmers, and that's when it really turned around.
Early on, the ratings are not there and the revenue's not there. You have a great anecdote in this book where you take the family out to the Hamptons and you're just like, let me get away from things. And you're listening intently to the fan. And you hear commercials ad nauseum for a discount funeral home. Funeral home. And you're just thinking, this is just so depressing. We can't have this on the air. What is that? What is that moment like?
Well, I came back and I said, I don't know how much they're paying us for those ads, but you're hearing it seemed like every 15 minutes. We're trying to launch a station. It can't be helping. And what they didn't tell me was that the discount funeral business was owned by the brother-in-law of one of our salespeople. And he just basically gave him the spots on the per inquiry basis, which means unless you sell a funeral, the station doesn't get paid. So I don't know how many people died that week, but I don't think the station got any money for it. And they said, if we told Smulyan exactly that, he would have killed all of us. So, there's so many crazy things that happen.
You also are listening on the first day, and Suzyn Waldman, who's now so familiar to everybody on the fan and all New York sports fan listeners, who's been an institution on Yankees broadcasts forever, she does an update. And you're listening, and you say, I listened in horror as she attempted to read a sports update. She was terrible, stumbling over her words. Inflections were off.
Yeah.
And she said, you'd said, we can't have this on the air. Now, that's some tough critique that you put in a book. Ultimately, you became a huge fan of Suzyn's work, but that sharp eye and ability to criticize, was that important not only to the fan, but also throughout your radio career?
No, because in reality, I didn't do that very much. I had a rule that you never call a disc jockey. If I had a problem, I called our head of programming. But I was so meshed in WFAN in the beginning. That was one of the few times I ever did that. And I remember going to Rick Cummings, who headed up the programming, and I said, Suzyn's awful. And we laugh about it now because we put her out in the field where she became the greatest field reporter in the history of sports. I talk about in the book, she really was responsible for Buck Showalter's managerial career by giving us some advice in Seattle. And when George Steinbrenner, when I asked Suzyn, we were at a Mariners game years later, who's the best manager in baseball? And she said, best young manager. And said, definitely Buck Showalter. So we immediately called him and flew him out to Seattle for an interview. George Steinbrenner had just fired all the coaches on that Yankee team. And he said, wait a minute, why are they interviewing this guy for a manager's job when I just fired him? So Steinbrenner gets him back in New York and immediately hires Showalter, and that was the start of his career. So all that comes from the Suzyn Waldman conversation. And I love Suzyn. We were inducted into the Hall of Fame a few months ago, and I adore Suzyn, and one of the great talents of all time. But I have to laugh. I normally never micromanage like that. But it was my baby. It was the first day. And she was, in retrospect, probably not very good at reading, updates.
And she's become an icon since then in her natural role of reporting, as you said. So tell us that Don Imus story now.
Well, when we were putting the station on the air, WFAN was on 1050. And in those days, we were buying the NBC stations, and you go, I have one AM and one FM. Well, 660 was a better frequency. So I had worked with Don Imus's agent because he had been Robert W. Morgan's agent in Los Angeles. So I knew Mike, and we were debating whether we were going to put Don on WFAN. Now, at the time, Don had been in and out of rehab for a long time. So that was going to be problematic. And I remember saying to Mike, let me see if I get this right. We have a radio station that's losing record amounts of money. We have a Major League Baseball team, the Mets, by 1988, had a litany of drug problems. And we have a morning guy who's been in rehab more than he's been out of rehab in the last 5 years. What could possibly go wrong putting all this? But we did. Don stayed sober the rest of his life. The Mets worked out their problems, and Fan became one of the great success stories in history. So I went from idiot to genius on that project.
You had inherited the Mets radio deal, so you had an anchor tenant on the radio station.
Right.
Could WFAN have worked if you didn't have one of the big sports properties in this city?
I think it would have been a lot tougher. I think it was an idea as time it probably was going to come. But I liken it to the shopping center business, where you're going to build a shopping center, you better have Sears or Penny or Neiman or one of the big stores to get traffic in the mall. And that's what the Mets did. The Mets brought traffic into the radio station because you knew that in 175 nights a year, you're going to have a lot of people tuning in for Mets baseball.
And you hit it at a time where the Mets are the hottest thing in the city.
Right.
They had just won in 86.
Right.
And they had this incredible group of charismatic guys in 87, 88, 89, 90. They're still in the hunt for the World Series.
Right.
Boy, that's just one of those things that you talk about. It's just a stroke of luck timing-wise that's when you got the Mets, and you didn't get them in like 1965.
Right. So, and that's life, Damon. I mean, you just never know what's going to work. I was very proud of it, and that's why I went from idiot to genius on that project.
I love some of the old imaging also from the Fan, because that's old imaging of my youth. And, the expanding jock strap was an infamous one that lives forever, expanded sports coverage. But we got to talk about one that never made air. I love this story in the book when you guys had a commercial. Starts out with a creaking sound, and then a cross rises slowly from the ground.
Right.
And on the cross is a referee.
Right.
And the imaging is there are only two things a New York sports fan wants, and the other is WFAN. And you ran this by some consultants, I guess, and they said, that ain't never going to work with the Archdiocese.
Somebody said, if you don't run that spot by the Archdiocese, you're dead. And we did. And they said, you run it and you're dead. So the spot never ran. The expanding jockstrap spot was one that we said we can only run a late night cable. Well, it was so much fun. And I think I talk about in the book that about a year later, radio's an industry where something works in one place, it's copied all over the country. And I'm driving down a freeway in Dallas, and I see this gigantic expanded jockstrap, and it says expanded coverage for the Dallas sports fan. And I went, oh my God, how could they put that on a billboard? We were running at midnight, on cable. And, we had fun with that project.
Different cultural fits in Texas in the 80s, I guess. So
that to the billboard.
Yeah, some of it is working, some of it isn't, but you have enough of support now and stability, and you need an afternoon drive show. And Lampley, Gumble, that national vibe's not working. Pete Franklin doesn't work out.
Yep.
You have a weekend guy in Mike Francesa.
Right.
You got a guy in Chris Russo, and you're thinking, maybe these two guys together. Let's start separately. What did you see in Chris Russo, the Mad Dog, before he became the Mad Dog?
Well, I think I remember the first time I heard him was on Emmis, and Emmis called him Donald Duck on steroids. And it was clear he had a unique talent. I can't take any credit for this decision, Damon. That was Mark Mason. Mark saw something in both of them to put them together. We all knew that Francesa was brilliant. We all knew that Russo had a great personality, but I think it was Mark Mason who said, let's try them together. And they didn't love each other, as it's been well chronicled over the years, but it came together and it was magic.
Did you think it was a good idea?
Well, I thought they both had a lot of talent. I never really did, but I thought they had a lot of talent, and it seemed like it made a lot of sense at the time.
Because, working in radio as long as I have, anybody can tell you kind of want to like your co-host. It doesn't have to be best friends. You don't have to be best men in weddings, but you kind of don't want to hate them and hate every day showing up. And they actively disliked one another. So there must have been a sense from you, even Mark and other people, hey, maybe this won't work because they actively dislike one another. Was that a concern?
No, I don't think it was well known that they didn't love each other in the beginning. It was sort of like, there was trepidation. I think so much had been written later about they really didn't love each other, and then over time they got to, respect and like each other. But I think it was sort of like, we think it'll work. What the heck? Yeah.
In retrospect, you're like, oh, of course that works. But at the time, there's no certainty there. Russo brings a frenetic, hyper energy, which is great on its own, but it needs somebody to ground it. Francesa brings this level, even keel, but encyclopedic knowledge. He needs somebody to up the energy.
Right.
So together it works, but it might not have worked. But I guess in retrospect, when you look at the two parts of the puzzle, man, they do fit together almost seamlessly, right?
And I think that was the idea. They're a perfect complement to each other. And I think that was the original idea. It's been so long ago, but I think that was the original idea.
How quickly did it work for them in the ratings?
Pretty quick. By that time, we had moved to 660. We had seen research that the concept of a sports radio station was resonating with sports fans. Because I remember the first research we did after about 6 months, most sports fans in New York still were going to WINS and WCBS for the updates at 15 and 45. And within 9 months after that, we were getting all that audience. So all of it came together to just work spectacularly.
There's a moment when you've launched WFAN, and I'm sure you're thinking, gosh, how much leash do I have here? How much rope do I have? This is a disaster.
Yeah.
Then you spin forward, and you guys are printing money. How quickly does the flip turn in the success of WFAN? Was it months?
Yeah, it wasn't long. I mean, I can still remember Joel Hollander, and I think I talk about it in the book, was our first sales manager. And I remember saying, gee, Joel, you'd think out of 60 million people, somebody would want to buy a spot somewhere. And he always said that. He said, I'm not known as a real hard guy. So he said, when Smulyan gives you grief for your lack of performance, it's tough. But then the ratings came, and then everything just exploded. So usually once you get ratings, it usually takes 1 or 2 rating books, and then it's validated by the agencies, and then everything comes together.
Right. The ratings are there, then the money comes in, and everything is good. Can you then sense how sports talk is affecting sports culture in the city?
No. Yes and no. I don't think, I've been asked, and I always tell that my favorite story is that sports talk changed how people in sports dealt with media. Because if you were an owner or a ball player or a manager, you got a bad column in the Post or the Daily News, and you read it at 8 a.m, you put it down, you went about your day. But with sports talk, it became an integral part of everybody's lives. So if you're a player or an owner or a manager and you get in your car in the morning, you might hear yourself get ripped. You play the game that afternoon and you drive home and you get yourself ripped for another mistake you made. And it really changed that sports really became 24/7 in every market in America, open for criticism. And one of my favorite moments, now it's a few years later, I'm in Seattle and I own the Mariners. And a friend from baseball, I guess I told the story of Gary Reinsdorf, said, I'm not a religious man, but to think that I'm listening to a radio station that's ripping the guy who's now an owner, and the guy who invented this format, who ruined all of our lives. And he's invented a format that's ruined everybody's life in sports. And now he owns the team and he's getting ripped by his invention. Proves to me that there's a God. And I know that and I never forgot that story. And it was true. It changed everybody's life. And I got on the other side of it. I'm an owner and people are saying, what a moron this guy is. So it's like,
Yeah, quite a karmic comeuppance for you, as it were. So did you ever hear from the Mets? Davey Johnson could get ripped now 24/7. Frank Cashin could get ripped 24/7. Darryl Strawberry, Dwight Gooden, all those guys. Did you ever hear from them? Because now they're being inundated by critique that they never had to deal with before.
Yeah, there was a tension, but sort of the idea was, look, you're also getting exposure and promotion of your product 24/7. So it comes with the territory. I've been on the other side of this. I'm very close to the Indianapolis Pacers and the Indiana Pacers and the Colts and have good friends. And, we, up until recently, we had the big sports talk station there. And every time I have lunch with somebody, they say, this guy said this and this guy said that. How could, it goes with the territory. You're getting exposure, but you've got to be able to accept fair criticism and sometimes unfair criticism. Yeah.
I also think that sports talk began to take the place of the sports columnist in New York throughout the 70s. Dick Young, Mike Lupica, et cetera. Those were heavy-hitting voices.
Right.
Now, Mike, Chris, and others were the voices. Did you start seeing the influence what they were saying had on maybe how the rest of the public felt?
Absolutely right. They had this soapbox. They were knowledgeable. People followed them. Sometimes they agreed with them. They disagreed with them. But it elevated sort of the impact of sports. I'm a student of history. Karl Marx, in his Communist Manifesto, said religion's the opiate of the masses. Well, today in the United States in 2023, sports is the opiate of the masses. This is what people care about. This is their escape from the world. And it's an integral part of their lives.
When did you see copycat sports talk happen after the success of the Fan?
When it started getting good ratings and making money. It didn't take, but it was pretty soon. I mean, I marveled today. I went to the Super Bowl because I'm talking about the book, and I had never been to Radio Row, and I marvel that from one sports talk station that you have hundreds of sports talk stations and networks and everything, integral part of people's lives all over the country.
I'm going to paraphrase this, but I heard you say this in a previous interview, was that there's something about radio that's caused you to invest in it beyond rationality, that there's a certain charm or magic to it that you're drawn to. As somebody who also loves the theater of the mind and has been committed to radio for my entire career, now 2 decades, I share the same opinion. What do you think that is about radio that grasps you so tightly?
I think it's just an integral part of your life. So when you're listening to something in your own community and it touches your life, your daily existence, I think it makes a big difference.
It is so important. You can't even imagine sports talk radio not having a local outlet, but it is kind of crazy to think that New Yorkers, all tens of millions of them up until 1987, didn't have a place to go.
Right.
It just kind of seems insane not to have had that platform for them now, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it does in retrospect. But if somebody had asked me, you think there'll be 700 people copying this idea? I would have said, no, I think that's probably the least likely thing I've ever heard.
You mentioned purchasing the Seattle Mariners in 1989, and ultimately it was not a success for you, a rare failure for you business-wise, and there was a lot of things stacked against you with how the Mariners where they were economically in baseball. That problem might be a little bit better today, but it's still a problem. But what was that financial disparity like in the late 80s in MLB?
Well, I got in trouble. I said, without revenue sharing, I said, to really own, and I admit it, to own a team in Seattle or Kansas City or Pittsburgh in those days, you really need to be a billionaire. because you're going to lose a lot of money. Now, I also said if you own the Yankees or the Dodgers, if you had a moderately successful paper route, you'd be fine. But, yeah, it was tough. And we were not prepared. We went through a downturn in radio. We got a $12 million collusion payment. We never got a cable TV deal. So, and when we bought it, we said, look, we just can't afford to sustain these losses. Yeah.
You got to be one of us in many ways,
Yeah.
a sports fan that grew up listening on the radio to then owning a professional
Right.
sports team. Were there moments where you were almost like Tom Hanks in Big? Oh my goodness, I'm a kid, but I'm in an adult world and I get to do all these things that I dreamt about?
Yeah, I was, although you were tempered by how tough the economics were. One of my best friends from college came up to watch us visit in Seattle, and we were in the office all day working, and then went to the ballpark a couple nights, and he said, "My God, you guys are you're working hard. This is like a real job." And I said, "The economics are so bad, it's an impossible real job." So one of my favorite lines is somebody said, "Every man in America wants to own a Major League Baseball team except the 30 that actually do." But I loved it. We made some great friends and had a lot of fun. Probably the best, I always say in the book, you do your greatest management in the toughest situations. And we invented things because we joked when we got there. We said, look, if we had bought the Red Sox, our marketing campaign is season starts April 5th. Get your tickets now. But in Seattle, you started by saying, okay, we know you think we suck, but here's we're new guys and we're going to try some fun things. And we did some really great things that were a lot of fun.
It also could not have been easy to draw people to the dark, cavernous, antiseptic kingdom either, right?
Yeah, it was, when we did it, we had all sorts of great ideas. The first thing we did is we brought the Lucas people in, Industrial Light and Magic, and said, okay, we know that everybody calls this a tomb. Let's do holograms on the wall, on the ceiling. So we're down 6 runs in the top of the 5th inning. Let's do thunder and lightning. And so the game's going to get rained out and the game's canceled. And we had all sorts of ideas. And they came in and they looked at it and said, look, your ideas are great and we could do it, but you don't even have a sound system up here that works. And we met with the county and said, hey, what about a new sound system? And this, we don't have any money for that. But if you put up the money, we'll reimburse you later. But it was an unloved building, and it made it much tougher. But we did all sorts of crazy stuff.
We would think anybody listening right now, man, that's the dream to own a professional sports team. But did you become disillusioned when you finally did it because of all the things that worked against you?
No, I loved it. I was really proud of the people we had. I was really proud of the things we did. We had singles nights. We had indoor fireworks. We had all sorts of contests. We invented a kid zone. We did all sorts of fun things that I was very proud of that are now commonplace anywhere. But it was like, our campaign was, look, you got to give us a try. We're doing fun stuff here. And it really, our biggest success was the average fan. We sold over 2 million tickets our second year. So people, it resonated, but the economics were just impossible.
So it sounds like, everything was kind of working against you financially. Did you have any regrets about decisions that you guys made?
Well, my closest friend was president of the team. And the day we sold the team, he said, what could we have done differently? And he said, given the economics, there was almost nothing that could be done. I think, and I talk about in the book, Seattle is a wonderful town. I loved it. I always said I'd like to do anything in Seattle but own their baseball team. But given the nature of the relationship between the team and the corporate community and the government, the lack of media revenues, the lack of other things, it was probably, I would say if you're on a field and you have to kick a 65-yard field goal into the wind to win the game, you shouldn't be on the field.
Was there ever any regrets about what you guys did at the Fan?
Well, I think, we certainly should have done it differently in the beginning. So I think we certainly made mistakes, but we had the staying power to correct them, and then it all turned around. I think if we had the staying power to correct some of the issues in Seattle, we had a great young team. We had Junior and Edgar Martinez and Randy Johnson. Over time, they were competitive and won enough that the economics allowed them to take care of themselves. A lot of times it's a question of how long can you stay in a situation till it turns around. Sometimes it never turns.
We'll wrap up with this. You were actually at Game 6 of the 1986 World Series.
Yeah.
Our first episode was highlighted by Mookie Wilson. We had a long conversation about that game, about the at-bat, about the ball going through Buckner's legs and the relationship that those guys ended up having, friendship over the years.
Yeah.
You're in the building.
Yep.
What was it like when they're down 2 runs and there's 2 outs? And what was it like when the Mets end up winning that game?
Well, the one thing that stands out is we were down right behind home plate near the Red Sox family, wives and family members. And they were all, obviously excited. We weren't that far from them. And when there were 2 outs, somebody inadvertently flashed the sign on the scoreboard, "Congratulations, Boston Red Sox 1986 World Champions." And I happened to see it and kind of laughed and said, "Boys, if the Mets come back, somebody's going to have seen their career ended." And then everything else happened, and it was just pandemonium. I mean, I can still remember being at the 7th game, but the 6th game, was one of those epic games of all time. And being there, it was our first year of owning the station and carrying the games. It was before we actually started FAN, but we had it, and it was just memorable. It was so much fun.
Boy, that's a good hood ornament. That's a good charm ahead of what you would do to have the Mets win the World Series in '86. You must have felt like, man, this is a good start to things.
It was a good start to things. Yes.
The book is Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down, the ups, downs, and reinvention of an entrepreneur. It goes into the history of WFAN, New York City radio. So for our listeners that are really into the history of the Fan, Mike and the Mad Dog, how the Mets came to be on the Fan, etc. It's a really great read. Father's Day is coming up. Good purchase there. Check it out. Never Ride a Roller Coaster Upside Down. Jeff Smulyan, our guest here on the show. Jeff, this was so good, man. Thanks so much for doing it.
Damon, I loved it. Thank you. And it's been delightful. Thank you.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Jeff.